Welcome to History Uncovered, where we delve into the stories and events that have shaped our world. In this episode, we will journey back to the turmoil of the 100 Years' War, to the fields of France where the seeds of legend were sown. We will follow the life of a figure so extraordinary, so enigmatic, her story continues to ignite the imagination centuries after her death. Today, we will journey into the realm of saints, soldiers, and saviors. A tale that weaves together faith, courage, and the most extraordinary trials of humanity. We're talking, of course, about the legendary figure, Joan of Arc, often known as the Maid of Orleans. Joan was an ordinary peasant girl, whose life took an extraordinary turn when she claimed to have received visions from saints, instructing her to support Charles VII and recover France from English domination late in the 100 Years' War. From humble beginnings to spectacular victories, to the heart-wrenching end at the stake, Joan's life and legacy resonate as a beacon of faith, conviction, and patriotic fervor. So, sit back as we take you on an immersive journey through the tumultuous period of the 15th century, exploring the mystique and the legend that surrounds Joan of Arc. Prepare to see history as you've never seen it before, vivid, emotional, and profoundly human. This is the tale of a girl who defied the norms of her time, driven by a divine mission, and forever altered the course of history. Welcome to the remarkable world of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc, the legendary Maid of Orleans, was born around 1412 in the small village of Domremy, nestled in the Meuse Valley in what is now the northeastern department of Vosges, France. Her exact birthdate remains a mystery, as Joan's own accounts of her age were always somewhat nebulous. Born to Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romee, she was one of 5 children in a family of modest means. Her father was a peasant farmer, tilling about 50 acres of land. He also supplemented the family's income by serving as a village official, handling duties such as tax collection and leading the local watch. Joan was born amidst the chaos and destruction of the 100 Years' War between England and France, a conflict that had erupted in 1337 over the status of English territories within France and English claims to the French throne. Virtually all the warfare had occurred on French soil, wreaking havoc on the French economy. As Joan entered the world, France was a nation divided. The French king, Charles VI, was frequently incapacitated by bouts of mental illness, leaving his brother Louis, the Duke of Orleans, and his cousin John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy, to feud over the regency of France. In 1407, John ordered the assassination of Louis, sparking a civil war. Charles of Orleans, who ascended to his father's dukedom at just 13, was placed under the protection of Bernard, Count of Armagnac. Those loyal to Charles became known as Armagnacs, while those siding with the Duke of Burgundy were called Burgundians. The future king, Charles VII, was known as the Dauphin, having assumed the title after the deaths of his 4 older brothers. In 1422, both Henry V and Charles VI died within 2 months of each other, and the infant Henry VI of England was nominally named the heir of the Anglo-French dual monarchy according to the treaty. However, the Dauphin also staked his claim to the French throne. During her youth, Joan of Arc lived a humble life, aiding her family with household chores, spinning wool, helping in the fields, and tending to their animals. Her mother was the source of Joan's religious education. The village of Domremy, where Joan was raised, lay within the Duchy of Bar, and despite being surrounded by lands sympathetic to the Burgundians, its people were staunchly loyal to the Armagnac cause. By 1419, the war had begun to affect the area directly, with a raid in 1425 that saw the village attacked and cattle stolen. It was in the aftermath of this raid that Joan had her first vision, a transformative event that marked the beginning of her extraordinary journey. At around 13, Joan claimed she was visited by a figure she identified as Saint Michael, who was accompanied by a host of angels. This vision moved her to tears, for she wished that they would take her with them. Throughout her life, she was regularly visited by Saint Michael, the patron saint of the Domremy area and considered a defender of France. Joan also reported visions of Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine, likely Margaret of Antioch and Catherine of Alexandria, 2 virgin saints who famously resisted powerful enemies, were martyred for their beliefs, and preserved their virtue to the end. Joan pledged her own vow of virginity to these heavenly voices. In these times, a prophecy circulated in the French countryside, foretelling that an armed virgin would arise to save France. Another prophecy attributed to Merlin promised that a virgin carrying a banner would bring an end to France's suffering. Joan began to imply that she was this foretold maiden, reminding those around her of a saying that France, having been ruined by a woman, would be restored by a virgin. In May 1428, Joan approached her uncle with a request to accompany him to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs. There, she petitioned the garrison commander, Robert de Baudricourt, for an armed escort to the Armagnac court at Chinon. Initially dismissed by Baudricourt, Joan was undeterred. When Domremy was raided by Burgundian forces, which resulted in the destruction of the village, Joan, her family, and the other villagers were forced to flee. She returned to Vaucouleurs in January 1429 and repeated her petition, once again denied by Baudricourt. However, she had managed to win the support of two of Baudricourt's soldiers, Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy. During this time, Joan was summoned to Nancy by Charles II, Duke of Lorraine, who was curious about her reputed abilities. Although Joan offered no cure to the Duke's illness, she did admonish him for his extramarital affairs. Meanwhile, the brothers of Henry V, John of Lancaster and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, continued to advance their conquest of France. They had gained control over most of northern France, Paris, and parts of southwestern France. The Burgundians held Reims, the traditional location for the coronation of French kings. The English had also started to surround Orleans, a strategic city that was the last obstacle to a full-scale assault on the remainder of Charles's territory. Joan's visions instructed her to leave Domremy to aid the Dauphin Charles. Finally, after a third meeting with Joan, Baudricourt agreed to provide her with an armed escort to Chinon for an audience with the Dauphin. Before setting off, Joan donned men's clothes provided by her escorts and the people of Vaucouleurs, a practice she would maintain for the rest of her life. When Joan of Arc first met Charles VII at the royal court in Chinon in early 1429, she was 17 years old and he was 26. She asserted that she was there to lift the siege of Orleans and to lead him to Reims for his coronation. In a private exchange, Joan reassured Charles that he was indeed the legitimate son of Charles VI and thus the rightful king. This meeting had a profound impact on Charles. Nevertheless, Charles and his council sought additional assurance. Joan was sent to Poitiers to be examined by a council of theologians. They deemed her to be a good person and a devout Catholic. Although they did not come to a definitive conclusion about the source of Joan's inspiration, they agreed that sending her to Orleans could potentially benefit the king and serve as a test of whether her inspiration was truly divine. Joan was then sent to Tours for a physical examination by women under the direction of Charles's mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon. The aim was to confirm her virginity, thus validating her potential role as the prophesied Virgin Savior of France, demonstrating the purity of her devotion, and ensuring she had not engaged with the devil. Once these tests were concluded satisfactorily, the Dauphin commissioned plate armor for Joan. She designed her own banner and was provided a sword unearthed from beneath the altar in the church at St. Catherine de Fierbois. Around this time, Joan started referring to herself as Joan the Maiden, underlining her virginity as a sign of her divine mission. Before Joan's arrival at Chinon, the situation for the Armagnac forces was dire, although not entirely without hope. They were prepared for a prolonged siege at Orleans. The Burgundians had recently withdrawn from the siege due to territorial disputes, and the English were unsure whether to continue. Nonetheless, after nearly a century of war, the morale of the Armagnacs was extremely low. Joan's addition to the Dauphin's cause started to lift their spirits. Her unwavering faith in the divine origins of her mission instilled newfound hope and devotion in the soldiers. Moreover, her belief transformed the ongoing Anglo-French dispute over inheritance into a religious war. Prior to beginning the journey to Orleans, Joan sent a letter to the Duke of Bedford, warning him that she was divinely mandated to drive him out of France. In late April 1429, Joan of Arc departed from Blois as part of an army carrying relief supplies for Orleans. She arrived on April 29 and met with Jean de Dunois, the commander of Orleans. Joan was initially treated as a morale-boosting figurehead without any formal command and was not included in military councils. However, she quickly gained the support of the Armagnac troops due to her apparent fearlessness in the midst of battle and the conviction that she was fighting for their salvation. Occasionally, Armagnac commanders even adopted the strategic advice she offered. On May 4th, the Armagnacs launched an offensive, targeting the Bastille de Saint-Lô. Despite a failed assault that initially led to a retreat, Joan's arrival with her banner rallied the troops, leading to a successful seizure of the fortress. No combat took place on May 5th, Ascension Thursday, a religious feast day. However, Joan sent another warning letter to the English, demanding they leave France. On May 6th, the offensive resumed, resulting in the capture of Saint-Jean-le-Blanc, which had been deserted by the English. Joan then urged the Armagnac commanders to assault Les Augustins, an English fortress built around a monastery. After its capture, Joan advocated for a continuous offensive. On the morning of May 7th, the Armagnacs attacked the primary English stronghold, Les Tourelles. Despite being injured by an arrow between her neck and shoulder, Joan returned to the battlefield, bolstering the morale of her forces and enabling a final successful assault. The English retreated from Orleans on May 8th, concluding the siege. Joan had previously claimed at Chinon that she was sent by God, stating that a sign would be given if she were taken to Orleans. Many interpreted the lifting of the siege as the promised sign. Prominent clergymen such as Jacques Gelou, the Archbishop of Embrun, and the theologian Jean Gerson wrote in support of Joan following this victory. In stark contrast, the English viewed Joan's ability to defeat their armies as evidence of her being possessed by the devil. After the victory at Orleans, Joan of Arc urged the Armagnac forces to march towards Reims to crown the Dauphin, Charles VII. Given permission to accompany the army, led by John II, Duke of Alençon, Joan proved herself a valuable asset, often consulted for her strategic advice. In order for Charles and his entourage to make the journey from Chinon to Reims, they needed to recapture the bridge towns along the Loire, Jargeau, Monts-sur-Loire, and Beaugency. The campaign to reclaim these towns started on June 11th, when the Armagnac forces, led by Alençon and Joan, arrived at Jargeau. Despite Joan's message urging the English to surrender, they refused, retreating inside the town's walls. Encouraging a direct assault, Joan and the Armagnacs took control of the town by the end of the following day, resulting in the capture of very few English prisoners and the death of many who had surrendered. Joan was an active participant in these battles, even attempting to scale a siege ladder at Jargeau before being struck by a stone that cracked her helmet. The Armagnac army then moved to Monts-sur-Loire, taking control of the town's bridge on June 15. The English forces retreated to a castle on the Loire's north bank. While Joan and her forces continued to besiege the castle at Beaugency, an English army from Paris, led by Sir John Fastolfe, joined the garrison at Mons. Unaware of the reinforced English presence, the garrison at Beaugency surrendered on June 18. The English army then began retreating towards Paris. Joan urged the Armagnacs to pursue them, leading to the Battle of Patay. The English had planned an ambush, but the Armagnac vanguard discovered and dispersed them, resulting in a significant defeat for the English. Fastolfe escaped with a small group of soldiers, but many English leaders were captured. Although Joan arrived too late to participate in the decisive action, her encouragement to pursue the English contributed significantly to the victory. Following the Armagnac victory at Patay, Joan of Arc maintained that it was imperative to crown Charles VII, despite some leaders suggesting an invasion of English-held Normandy. Charles agreed with Joan, and the army departed Gien on June 29 for Reims. Their march was virtually unopposed, and towns along their route pledged their allegiance to the Armagnacs without resistance. The only significant resistance came from Troyes, a town with a small English and Burgundian garrison. After a few days of negotiation, Joan organized a potential assault, prompting Troyes to surrender. Reims surrendered on July 16, 1429, and Charles was crowned the next day, with Joan being given a prominent role in the ceremony. She announced that the will of God had been fulfilled with his coronation. A temporary truce was negotiated with the Duke of Burgundy, who promised to assist in transferring Paris to Armagnac control. However, at the end of the truce, the Duke retracted his promise. Despite Joan and the Duke of Alençon pushing for an immediate march on Paris, internal divisions within Charles's court and ongoing negotiations with Burgundy resulted in a slower approach. Approaching Paris, many towns surrendered to the Armagnacs without resistance. An encounter with the English forces near Montpellier ended in a standoff after the English refused to be provoked into attacking. The English retreated the next day, and the Armagnacs proceeded to launch an assault on Paris on September 8. Joan was injured in the leg by a crossbow bolt during the battle and had to be rescued. The Armagnacs suffered heavy casualties, and Charles ordered a halt to the assault. Despite Joan's objections, and even after she and Alençon developed new plans to attack Paris, Charles dismantled a necessary bridge, leading to a retreat by the Armagnacs. Following the failed attack on Paris, Joan's influence in the French court diminished. Her assertiveness did not align with the court's diplomatic approach towards Burgundy. Scholars from the University of Paris suggested that her failure to capture Paris indicated that her guidance was not of divine origin. In September, Charles disbanded the army, and Joan was not permitted to collaborate with the Duke of Alençon again. In October, Joan was part of a military force tasked with attacking the lands of Perronet Gressart, a mercenary who had previously served the English and Burgundians. The army first besieged Saint-Pierre-le-Moutier, successfully capturing it after Joan advocated for a direct assault on November 4. However, they were unsuccessful in their attempts to capture La Chère-sur-Loire during November and December and were forced to abandon their artillery during the retreat. This defeat further tarnished Joan's reputation. By the end of December, Joan returned to court where she discovered that she and her family had been ennobled by Charles as a reward for her services to him and the kingdom. Prior to the September attack on Paris, Charles had negotiated a 4-month truce with the Burgundians. This truce was later extended until Easter of 1430. During this period of truce, the French court had no immediate need for Joan. In the early months of 1430, the Duke of Burgundy began reclaiming towns that, while ceded to him in treaty agreements, had not yet submitted to his authority. Compiègne was one such town, among many in regions that the Armagnacs had previously recaptured. At the end of March 1430, Joan, accompanied by a band of volunteers, embarked on a mission to relieve the besieged town of Compiègne. This expedition, launched without Charles's explicit permission as he was still observing a truce, sparked debate among historians. Some suggest it was a desperate and potentially treasonous act, while others argue it could not have proceeded without the implicit financial support of the court. In April, Joan arrived at Melun, which had recently ejected its Burgundian garrison, and her force swelled as additional commanders joined her. After advancing to Lagny-sur-Marne and defeating an Anglo-Burgundian force led by the mercenary Francois d'Arras, Joan allowed the local townspeople to execute the captured d'Arras following a trial, a deviation from the usual practice of ransoming or exchanging captives. Joan reached Compiègne on May 14. After defending the town against the Burgundian besiegers, she disbanded the majority of her army due to the difficulties the surrounding countryside was experiencing in supporting such a large force. Joan, accompanied by approximately 400 remaining soldiers, entered Compiègne. On May 23, 1430, during an unsuccessful attack on the Burgundian camp at Margny, Joan was captured. She surrendered to a pro-Burgundian nobleman, Lionel de Wandam, and was promptly relocated to his castle at Beaulieu-les-Fontaines. Following her first escape attempt, Joan was moved to Beaurevoir Castle. There, she made a second escape attempt, leaping from a tower window into a dry moat, and although injured, survived. In November, she was relocated again to the Burgundian town of Arras. News of Joan's capture was met with jubilation by the English and Burgundians, who were pleased to see her removed as a military threat. The English negotiated with the Burgundians to pay Joan's ransom and take her into their custody. Bishop Pierre Cauchon of Beauvais, a supporter of the Duke of Burgundy and the English, played a prominent role in these negotiations. In November, an agreement was reached requiring the English to pay 10,000 livres tournois to take possession of Joan. Once the ransom was paid, Joan was moved to Rouen, the English headquarters in France. There is no evidence to suggest that Charles made any attempt to save Joan after she was transferred to English custody. Joan of Arc was brought to trial for heresy in Rouen on January 9, 1431. She was accused of blasphemy for wearing men's clothing, for claiming to receive visions from demonic entities, and for refusing to submit to the authority of the Church, instead insisting she would be judged by God alone. Her captors framed her trial within ecclesiastical jurisdiction to downplay its overtly political undertones. In her defense, Joan claimed her visions guided her to defeat the English and crown Charles, asserting this as proof that her actions were divinely sanctioned. This testimony, if unchallenged, posed a serious threat to the English claim to the French throne, as well as to the University of Paris, which advocated for a dual monarchy led by an English king. The outcome of the trial was preordained. By painting Joan as guilty, her captors could undermine Charles's legitimacy, suggesting he had been crowned through the actions of a heretic. Bishop Pierre Cauchon presided over the trial, with the English providing financial backing, including payments to Cauchon and Jean Lemaitre, representing the Inquisitor of France. Most of the participating clergy were French, and two-thirds had ties to the University of Paris, but the majority were decidedly pro-Burgundian and pro-English. Despite efforts by Cauchon to follow the proper inquisitorial procedure, the trial was plagued by irregularities. Joan should have been in the custody of the Church and guarded by women, but was instead imprisoned by the English and overseen by male soldiers. Contrary to canon law, Cauchon proceeded with the trial without establishing Joan's infamy, and Joan was not informed of the charges against her until after the interrogations had begun. These procedures fell short of inquisitorial standards, with Joan subjected to extended interrogations without legal counsel. There were allegations that the trial records had been doctored. During the trial, Joan demonstrated remarkable composure. She managed to direct her interrogators to ask questions one at a time, refer to their records when needed, and conclude sessions at her request. She skillfully navigated a theological trap when asked whether she knew she was in God's grace, by responding that if she wasn't, she hoped God would put her there, and if she was, she hoped to remain so. This astute response left her interrogators stunned. Despite being shown instruments of torture, Joan refused to be intimidated. When Cauchon and a group of assessors voted on whether to use torture, the majority decided against it. In early May, Cauchon asked the University of Paris to consider 12 articles summarizing the accusations of heresy, which the university approved. On May 23, Joan was officially warned by the court. The following day, she was brought to the Abbey churchyard of Saint-Ouen for public condemnation. As her sentence was read, Joan agreed to submit, signing a document of abjuration that included an agreement not to bear arms or wear men's clothing. As per the rules of the time, public heresy was considered a capital offense. An unrepentant or relapsed heretic could be handed over to secular courts for execution. Having signed the abjuration, Joan was no longer classified as an unrepentant heretic, but she was still at risk of execution if found guilty of relapse into heresy. A condition of her abjuration was that Joan had to stop wearing men's clothing. She changed into a woman's dress and allowed her head to be shaved. Instead of being moved to a church prison, she was returned to her cell and kept in chains. Witnesses later testified at the rehabilitation trial that Joan had been mistreated and subjected to attempted rapes, including one by an English nobleman. Guards were said to have placed men's clothes in her cell, forcing her to wear them. When Bishop Cauchon was informed that Joan had started wearing male attire again, he sent clerics to warn her to comply with the terms of her abjuration. However, the English prevented these clerics from visiting Joan. On May 28, Cauchon, accompanied by several other clerics, visited Joan in her cell. According to the trial record, Joan justified her return to men's clothing by stating it was more appropriate given that she was guarded by men. She also claimed that the judges had not upheld their promise to allow her to attend Mass and remove her chains. She expressed willingness to obey if the judges fulfilled their promises and moved her to a proper prison. When asked about her visions, Joan maintained that her voices had reprimanded her for her abjuration, done out of fear, and she would not disavow them again. Given that her abjuration required her to deny her visions, this statement was enough to convict Joan of relapsing into heresy and sentence her to death. The next day, 42 assessors were summoned to decide Joan's fate. The majority recommended that the abjuration be explained to her once again. However, they ultimately voted unanimously that Joan was a relapsed heretic and should be handed over to the English, who held secular power, for punishment. At around 19 years of age, Joan was executed on May 30, 1431. That morning, she was allowed to receive the sacraments, which was unusual as heretics were typically denied this right. She was then taken to the old marketplace in Rouen, where her sentence was publicly read. Rather than being handed over to the appropriate authority, the bailiff of Rouen, for secular sentencing, she was given directly to the English. Joan was tied to a tall, plastered pillar for execution by burning. As she faced her death, she asked to see a cross. An English soldier provided her with one made from a stick, which she kissed and held to her chest. A processional crucifix was fetched from the church of Saint-Sava, which Joan embraced before her hands were bound. It was held in front of her eyes throughout her execution. Following her death, her remains were thrown into the Seine River. Joan's execution didn't change the military situation significantly. Her victories had boosted the morale of the Armagnacs, while the English failed to regain their momentum. Charles remained the King of France, even though a rival coronation was held for the 10-year-old Henry VI of England at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris in 1431. In 1435, the Burgundians abandoned their alliance with England by signing the Treaty of Arras. 22 years after Joan's death, the war ended with a French victory at the Battle of Castillon in 1453. The English were expelled from all of France except Calais. Joan's execution became a political liability for Charles, as it suggested that his consecration as the King of France had been achieved through the actions of a heretic. On February 15, 1450, a few months after Charles regained Rouen, he ordered Guillaume Bull, a theologian and former rector of the University of Paris, to open an inquiry. After a brief investigation and interviewing 7 witnesses from Joan's trial, Bull concluded that the judgment of Joan as a heretic was arbitrary. She had been a prisoner of war treated as a political prisoner, and was executed without basis. Although Bull's report couldn't overturn the verdict, it paved the way for a later retrial. In 1452, a second inquest into Joan's trial was opened by Cardinal Guillaume d'Estouteville, a papal legate and relative of Charles, and Jean Brihel, the recently appointed Inquisitor of France. They interviewed about 20 witnesses and based their inquest on 27 articles describing how Joan's trial had been biased. Right after the inquest, d'Estouteville granted an indulgence to those who participated in the ceremonies in Joan's honor on May 8, commemorating the lifting of the siege. For the next 2 years, d'Estouteville and Brihel worked on the case. Brihel forwarded a petition from Joan's mother, Isabel, and Joan's brothers Jean and Pierre, to Pope Nicholas V in 1454. Brihel also submitted a summary of his findings to theologians and lawyers in France and Italy, as well as a professor at the University of Vienna, the majority of whom gave opinions favorable to Joan. After Pope Nicholas V died in early 1455, the new pope, Calixtus III, gave permission for a rehabilitation trial and appointed 3 commissioners to oversee the process: Jean Juvenal de Ursins, Archbishop of Reims, Guillaume Chartier, Bishop of Paris, and Richard Olivier de Longueuil, Bishop of Coutances. They chose Brihel as inquisitor. The rehabilitation trial began on November 7, 1455 at Notre Dame Cathedral, when Joan's mother publicly delivered a formal request for her daughter's rehabilitation. The trial ended on July 7, 1456 at Rouen Cathedral, after hearing from about 115 witnesses. The court found that the original trial was unjust and deceitful. Joan's abjuration, execution, and their consequences were nullified. In his summary of the trial, Brihel suggested that Bishop Cauchon and the assessors who supported him might be guilty of malice and heresy. To emphasize the court's decision, a copy of the articles of accusation was formally torn up. The court ordered that a cross should be erected on the site of Joan's execution. That brings us to the end of the remarkable story of Joan of Arc, a woman of faith and resilience, who continues to inspire us centuries after her death. It's a tale of faith, courage, and a tragic end, but also of eventual vindication and sainthood. Thank you for watching this episode of History Uncovered. If you found this video informative and engaging, please like and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories from the past. We strive to uncover and present the most intriguing, dramatic, and lesser-known stories from history, just like the one we've explored today. And don't forget to ring the bell for notifications so that you never miss a new video. We've got plenty more historical insights where this came from. As we delve further into the past, who knows what intriguing narratives we'll uncover next. Once again, thank you for your time and your interest in history. Until next time, keep exploring, stay curious, and remember that history is a fascinating, ever-unfolding story in which we all play a part.